designs on Iraq have been well known and well understood for a long time, but I think we have to see all of these invasions and overthrows and all of the destabilization in the Middle East in recent years as part of a grander Zionist project for reshaping the Middle East that we can say not only predates that 5-year plan that General Wesley Clark talks about, but predates it by decades at the very least, documentably and on the record. So let's take a look at part of that record. And we're going to take a look at an important document that you can find out more about at an article that was posted on globalresearch.ca in March of this year called Greater Israel, the Zionist Plan for the Middle East. And this talks about the Oded Yunon Plan, which was something that was developed in a document that was published in 1982 in the journal called Directions, that's published by the Department of Information for the World Zionist Organization. And this document was translated into English by the Association of Arab American University Graduates. So I will put the English translation in the links for the show notes for today's episode, so you can go and read this document for yourself directly. I think it's a very eye-opening document going back, again, well, actually 3 decades now, to Israel's bigger foreign policy and its plans for basically breaking and carving up the Middle East in order to institute this Greater Israel idea. And it lays this out in some detail, but let's just take a look at just the operative part of this document, talking about what the Israeli plans for Syria was in this World Zionist Organization document. And it says, quote, "The dissolution of Syria and Iraq later on into ethnically or religiously unique areas, such as in Lebanon, is Israel's primary target on the Eastern Front in the long run, while the dissolution of the military power of those states serves as the primary short-term target. Syria will fall apart, in accordance with its ethnic and religious structure, into several states, such as in present-day Lebanon, so that there will be a Shiite Alawi state along its coast, a Sunni state in the Aleppo area, another Sunni state in Damascus, hostile to its northern neighbor, and the Druzes, who will set up a state, maybe even in our Golan, and certainly in the Hauran and in northern Jordan. This state of affairs will be the guarantee for peace and security in the area in the long run, and that aim is already within our reach today." End quote. Yes, peace and security as defined by the Zionists of the Israel foreign policy planning community, i.e. peace and stability for Israel. And certainly it does absolutely play into Israel's interests to keep the Middle East area divided ethnically and religiously and get those different sects fighting with each other, because that obviously makes for the for the divide and conquer strategy that has been the go-to strategy for would-be imperialists and tyrants for millennia, and it certainly does serve Israel's foreign policy purposes to keep the Muslims fighting amongst each other along their religious and sectarian lines, rather than fighting against Israel. And that's exactly, lo and behold, what is happening in Syria, as we see the Sunni majority fighting against the Alawite sect, that the minority that has been in power under Assad and under his father for decades now in Syria. And it is interesting to see not only, of course, the native inhabitant Sunnis of Syria, but of course all the foreign-funded jihadists who are being shipped into the country, who are fueling this very conflict. And in fact, if people go back to my interviews on RT back at the very start of this Syrian uprising, back 2.5 years ago now, you'll see that I made this point specifically, that part of what this is all about is the destabilization of the Shia land bridge, the so-called land bridge that connects Iran all the way to its Hezbollah forces in Lebanon through that Shia land bridge that runs through Syria. But if that can be destabilized and the Shia Alawite sect minority that rules Syria can be replaced with a Sunni majority ruling over the country, then that would break up that link between Iran and Lebanon and would further destabilize and isolate Iran on the path towards committing, well, the ultimate strike on Iran. And this is something that can be seen in the policy planning documents of various think tanks, such as the now infamous Which Path to Persia document from the Brookings Institution, which Tony Cartalucci of Land Destroyer Report has written about so much. So there are definite geopolitical interests for Israel and its adjunct, the United States, in the Middle East, in keeping Syria divided against each other, and that is a very key part in what's taking place there in Syria. But That isn't all. Surprisingly enough, for people in the United States, there are other factors in the Middle East other than the United States and Israel. And there are other players who are trying to become regional players in various different degrees as a result of this. And of course, in that regard, we have to look to some of Syria's neighbors and some of the other people in the region who are looking to step up, including Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and how they all fit into this and what their part to play is in this Syrian drama. And as we start to expand the scope of this, of course, one of the things that, as always in these Middle Eastern conflicts, comes into play is the resource wars that is always at least part of what's going on. So let's take a look at one of the interesting developments in recent years that has really, I think, been one of the focal points for why it is so important to kick off the Syrian war now, and that is the prospect of an Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline. Now, this is something that, in fact, has been on the table for a couple of years now, and just for more information on that, let's quickly turn to the Tehran Times from July 26th of 2011, which had this story: Iran, Iraq, Syria sign major gas pipeline deal. Iran, Iraq, and Syria have signed a deal for the construction of the Middle East's largest gas pipeline, which would transit Iranian gas from Iran's South Pars gas field to Europe via Lebanon and the Mediterranean Sea. According to the deal, Iranian gas will be transited to Greece and other European countries via a 6,000-kilometer pipeline crossing through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon and under the Mediterranean Sea, end quote. Now, this is an exceptionally important pipeline because, as you might have noticed there, this gas is being transported from the Iranian South Pars field, the largest known gas field in the world, to via Iraq, via Syria, through Lebanon, the Mediterranean, to Europe directly, which would mean Iranian gas going to Europe, which would be something that would be quite a boon for the increasingly isolated Iranian government, of course, and one that would potentially upset the balance of power in the increasing moves towards isolating Iran, but also exceptionally significant because it bypasses, for example, Turkey, which has positioned itself as being the east-west energy crossroads, where all of these pipelines tend to transit through on their way to Europe. This would bypass Turkey altogether, so that would upset a would-be regional power like Turkey as well. So this is an exceptionally important pipeline. Again, the memorandum of understanding on it has been inked, and this has been moved just one step closer towards becoming a reality, which is another reason why this destabilization had to take place and why it is taking place. Now, this has been commented on by a number of different analysts, so let's turn to one of my favorites, someone who has been a guest on this program before in the past and always has insightful analysis of these types of incidents. And I'm talking about F. William Engdahl, who of course is at engdahl.oilgeopolitics.net. I'll put the link in the show notes. Let's listen to a speech that he gave recently where he outlined exactly how this pipeline and the religious strife and sectarian strife in Syria play into the current destabilization of al-Assad's government.
Well, after the brutal military action in Libya to destroy that country, not just Gaddafi, but that country, the U.S. decided to move on to Syria. This is a long-term plan. It's been on the Pentagon war map for at least a decade to change the political map of the Middle East. And they thought they could roll into Syria on the momentum of Libya and destroy the al-Assad regime and bring in a Muslim Brotherhood opposition in Syria. Well, Syria is a country, if you look on the map behind me, it's a country with many different religious minorities. Druze, Sunni is the majority, Alawite is a minority, Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite, his wife is a Sunni, and you have the Kurds. For many, many years, Syrian friends of mine have assured me, all different religious groups lived together side by side in a society that was basically secular. There was no Alawite belief being forced on the Sunni majority by al-Assad or his father. And suddenly Syria was under attack. Now, if you go to the next slide, the next overhead, you'll see the critical location of Syria geopolitically in the Middle East. Syria borders Turkey, it borders Israel, it borders Lebanon, it borders Iraq. And in 2011, Bashar al-Assad's government signed a contract with the government of Iran and the government of Iraq to build a gas pipeline from the South Pars gas field, the largest gas field known in the world today, so that Iran could market its gas through Iraq, whose prime minister is a Shia Muslim, and through Syria, whose prime minister is an Alawite, but on friendly terms with both Iraq and with Iran. Iranian natural gas potentially, ultimately, into the European market, either through port locations in Syria or through Lebanon. Now, it begins at this point to get very geopolitically complicated, but basically, when that agreement was announced by the Syrian government, the US and NATO allies organized a massive, dramatic escalation of the destruction of the al-Assad regime, accusing al-Assad of terrorism, accusing him of civilian atrocities, everything, the usual playbook that is used by the State Department to demonize anyone they don't like. But in reality, the factor of this new pipeline created a major geopolitical challenge, not just to the United States, but interestingly enough, to Israel, which in 2010 had discovered a huge, for the first time in Israeli history since 1948, a huge offshore gas field called Leviathan in the eastern Mediterranean. And Israel began nursing ambitions of becoming an energy